Hello, everyone. Welcome to ACCCRN webinar. As you may already know, ACCCRN with our partners are very happy to have you in the discussion today. We are a leading regional network connecting professionals and communities across Asia to build inclusive urban climate change resilience. We deliver our value through amplifying the local voices, facilitating collaboration among practitioners, supporting local and community initiatives for resilience, and connecting practitioners, community, government officials, and the private sector to join hands in building urban resilience. We hope everyone will gain benefit from the webinar, treating this as a learning platform to exchange ideas and experiences to promote cross-learning among different individuals and groups. Before I continue, I will explain the webinar ground rules. In this Blackboard platform, general participants will be muted during the presentations, but all of you will be able to provide questions through the chat box feature. Moderators may have certain methods on the discussion, including the Q&A session that will be explained further. And this webinar is recorded and uploaded and will be uploaded to ACCCRN's website soon. Once again, thank you for joining. Now we shall start the webinar. And I'm Yoga, Member Relations Manager for Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, that also will be the moderator for today's webinar. So today we will be having a webinar on communicating resilience with our main topic, engage people to participate in urban climate change resilience discussion. So we start from our background with so many questions in this UCCR field related to communication. How to develop a basic understanding of urban climate change resilience that can be understood by people, especially to the non-UCCR expert background. And how to make the definition sound simple without losing the fundamental meaning of the terminology. We also have so many questions related to how to engage people to pay attention to information and discussion related to UCCR, and how to make an effective two-way communications in this discussion. Today, we are having Will Bugler, a senior communications consultant and communications lead at Acclimatise. He is an expert in communicating climate change adaptation, risk, and resilience, and Will coordinates Acclimatise knowledge and communications work and manage the company's knowledge and networks programs. Hello, Will.
Hello there. Hi. Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Very well. Very well. Very pleased to be here speaking today.
Yeah, thank you. So all of us are very interested to the topic because I'm pretty sure that this is also not much being discussed currently about communicating resilience especially to talk about resilience in a wider public. So ACCCRN is very happy to host the discussion and having you as the speaker today to speak about engage people to participate in UCCR discussion, and we will be very happy to learn so many things from you.
Very pleased to be here, and yeah, we'll be happy to contribute to the wider debate if it can be useful.
Okay. So after this, you will give your presentation, and then after your presentation, there will be followed by Q&A session. So everyone can just jump in through the chat feature. If you have any questions, I will monitor the chat feature. If there's any questions that being raised during your presentation, I will take some notes and we will discuss it after you present your presentation.
That sounds good.
So, okay, now the time is yours, Will, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that great introduction, And hello and good afternoon to all of you who've joined. To those of you in Asia, good morning, and those in Europe and Africa, good morning. In Asia, good afternoon, I should say. And if you've joined in the Americas, well, you should know that this has been recorded, and you could probably go to bed. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me. We're discussing this tricky topic of how to get public on climate change resilience and urban climate change resilience, which is a challenge that has really dogged scientists for many years. So a bit of a challenge to discuss it, and there's a lot still to learn in this area. My name's Will Bugler, and I'm a senior communications consultant for Acclimatise Group Limited. I've been working on climate change resilience communications for the last 7 years or so. Can I change my slides? How do I change my slide? I don't think I can do that.
Yes, wait, I will share it.
Thanks.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So in this webinar, what I hope to do is give you some insight into how to approach communications around climate change. I'll be trying to show you why we really need to start communicating about climate resilience differently, shifting from kind of talking down from the information to talking up from the point of where the communities and people are, and of the importance of getting to know your audience and really knowing your audience very well, with some hints about how to make people connect with what you're saying. And I'll be talking a bit about why we need to be talking more about climate resilience, and understanding how to frame our message on urban climate resilience, to help us tell stories that people can relate to. So a little very quick bit about Acclimatise. We're an advisory consulting firm specialising in climate change risk and resilience. And one of our services is around communicating climate resilience. So in the past, we've worked with the ACCCRN to develop communication and engagement approaches. We've partnered with ICAD in Bangladesh to look at private sector attitudes to climate adaptation. We've done some work with TARU Leading Edge in India, and we're currently working on a project for the Asian Development Bank on knowledge management and communications around its Urban Resilience Fund. So urban climate change resilience is a tricky topic for communicators, and you might accuse me here of getting my excuses in early about why we don't have all the answers, but it really is one of the most challenging communications efforts that has been kind of tackled. The causes of climate change are there are many causes. They're widely distributed among the population. They're often invisible and occur far away from people live. The impacts are delayed, and often are only partly attributable to the causes. There are these many layers of reasons why communications around climate change are made more difficult, and kind of distanced from people's everyday lives. So how can we make one of the most challenging conversations a little bit more difficult? Is probably to add in a generous helping of resilience, right, which is another complex term, requires complex systems thinking across different scales. It's a real double whammy of complexity. But as practitioners and researchers working on climate resilience, we really need to start asking serious questions about how we go about engaging with the public on the issue. And I'm going to be talking a bit about how much engagement matters, but we need to think about, what do people really care about when they think about urban climate resilience? What messages are we using? What methods are we using to engage people? And if we're not thinking about those things, then we're probably doing an ineffective job. With urban climate resilience, it's really important to realize that you can't separate it from attitudes and responses to climate change more broadly. So people are unlikely to have strong feelings about the term resilience, because it's in effect an unfamiliar concept. But so there's work to do there to familiarize themselves with people with ideas around resilience, but they'll almost certainly have a view on climate change. And this is the thing, their values and their views around climate change, that's going to be the thing that's going to shape their response to your communications. So the idea of urban climate change resilience is one that comes from academia, and I think it's really important that we recognize this. It's taken by researchers, and it's now just about being put into practice by many of those organizations and individuals at the forefront of the discipline, some of you listening today included. So I think my first point is that if you try and invite people, the public, into your world, they're going to refuse that invitation. It's to make engagement successful, you're going to have to take your work to the audience, and you'll need to know how to make them care about that. So why does engagement matter? Well, public engagement on climate change is important because the public helps to drive change. They help to change policy, to change social attitudes. They help to change behavior. And this is particularly relevant when we're talking about urban climate change resilience. It happens in cities, amongst communities. The actions to increase urban climate change resilience rely on the support of the community, and resilience approaches themselves also rely on communities to be at the heart of the resilience building process, shaping the vision for their city, its priority, and coming to kind of shared solutions to challenges like climate change. So the second reason why successful communications and engagement matters is more kind of pragmatic, and that is that you really want to have your work have impact. You want your research to influence the people that it addresses, right? So in that case, you need to put the effort in, and we need to get more creative about how research findings are presented and communicated. So think about the amount of effort that you put into your research, and to developing your reports, and to writing them and publishing them and getting peer reviewed, versus communicating the messages of those reports. Honestly, have a think about what the balance is. Best practice suggests that maybe it could be 60-40 to research communications, or even 50-50, and I would imagine that is a ratio that is very rarely achieved. The world, and it has serious impact, serious consequences. There's a World Bank study some years ago looked at around 1,500, as it says there, 1,611 of its reports, policy reports, written in the 4 years from 2008 to 2012, and the study found that while 13% of the reports were downloaded over 250 times, there were 31% that were never downloaded at all. And I think that that's a real indication of how communications can blunt the impact of a lot of hard work. So another small caveat before we go on is that we have an awful lot to learn about the attitudes and views of people towards climate change in communities, especially in Asia. The vast majority of research into climate-related communications has been conducted in North America and some also in Europe. And there's a really great need for more research into public attitudes and opinions towards climate change in Asia. There has been some very good work recently by the good people at Climate Outreach in India. But given the diverse cultures, languages, and contexts around Southeast Asia and Asia, I mean, there's a huge amount more work to be done. There's a recent report from Climate Tracker on language in reporting climate change, which looks at media reporting in Nepal, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And it shows how climate change is reported in those countries. And it explains that to reach the poorest and most vulnerable people, We really need new forms of communication that are in local languages, and that don't rely so heavily on text-based reporting in areas where perhaps literacy rates are lower. Another significant problem is that much of the communications around climate change and urban climate change resilience is written in English still, and there's far less coverage in the media in local languages, and that presents a problem when we're talking about public engagement in these issues. So there's clearly then a clear need for new messengers, new forums for dialogue, and new initiatives really at the community level. So there's plenty of work to be done. So then the question is, what are the techniques that we can apply to engage people on climate change and urban resilience? So what communication guru can we turn to for help? So you might be able to laugh at Donald Trump's lack of scientific understanding when it comes to climate resilience, but he understood how to frame a message that connected with his voters. The fact that Donald Trump is now president of the United States is testament in a way to the power of public engagement and communications. How much of those communications came from the Kremlin remains to be seen, of course, but communications definitely played a big part nonetheless. What made his offering attractive to the American people was that Trump realized that people are not convinced by details. They're not convinced by more information. They believe in a story, and he connected with his voters' values, and he could frame his message, and that was incredibly powerful. And this really is the first lesson when communicating to the public on climate change and resilience. It pays to speak to people's values rather than use simple facts and figures. Communication, we really need to start turning it on its head from top down to a bottom up approach, starting with community values. So the currency, which is a difficult thing, right, because the currency of urban climate change resilience practitioners and researchers is information. For many years, the standard approach in climate communication has to be to provide people with facts and assume that they'll come to the right conclusion. And this tactic has proved to be kind of spectacularly ineffective. So research from Yale University, a guy called Dan Kahan, found that the most scientifically literate climate skeptics were the least concerned about climate risks. And he also showed how people would misread graphs relating to climate change, even when they've successfully been able to read the same graph when it related to other less controversial, in inverted commas, topics. So there are no killer facts that will make people engage with urban climate change resilience. So where to go from there then? So community engagement is vital. What do we need to understand about people in order for them to be receptive to new ideas that might challenge the status quo, like those around urban climate resilience? Well, what in a way this comes back to is an old-fashioned kind of communications necessity of really knowing your audience. And for urban climate resilience, this is particularly important as it's the foundation of resilience approaches includes these participatory engagement at that local level. So the audience is vital to the whole approach. When producing communications material, it pays to have a specific person in mind when you're writing for an audience. So it's far easier to write for a character than it is to write for a range of people. So if you define, 25 to 35-year-olds women, it's a much more difficult thing to speak to or write to than saying a 25-year-old woman who lives with her husband and has 3 children, and works part-time. If you can build the more detail you can put into the character, the easier it is to talk to that person. what specifically do we need to understand about the audience? I think the most important thing really are their values and attitudes. So the way people read and understand information presented depends largely on their values. People are very sensitive to implied values and can react defensively or negatively if they don't align with their own. So we need to really understand what matters to our target audience, and frame our messages in a way that matches their values or that speaks to those values. And this graph really demonstrates this quite well. This is from research again in the US, but it shows that people's political views were a very good predictor of their ability to answer this question around whether global warming was linked to human activities of burning fossil fuels. And those with more conservative Republican values were far less inclined to agree that there was solid evidence of global warming than those with Liberal Democrat values. Now, they've had this access largely to the same amount of information, but the information is shaped by their values. And the research into values, that can actually be quite instructive when considering how we communicate around climate change. So this is, I don't know, I hope you can see this, but this is a values map taken from empirical research actually conducted by a guy called Shalom Schwartz in the early 90s. And what it is a map of different values that were identified that people held. So people hold different values, and we move around this values map. Well, we don't hold solely one part of these values at one time. We do move around, but in the top right of the diagram there, we have intrinsic values, and these are values like social justice, wisdom, honesty, protecting the environment, equality, unity with nature, broad-mindedness. These are kind of self-transcendent values, sort of collaborative values almost. And then in the bottom left, we have extrinsic values, and those are values that are driven by ambition, wealth, authority, influence, social power, those kind of things. And so research in the UK largely has shown that most people identify with intrinsic values in the top right, and that is actually regardless of their political views or of their income, of their class. Most people identify best with messages that are framed in terms of those universal or benevolent values. So communications that focus on extrinsic, the bottom left values, emphasize things like cost savings, increase in status and reputation, profit and loss, maintaining respect, for example, increasing growth. So we can think about urban climate resilience communications that touch on those, that point towards those kind of values, around, you know, cost savings, or yeah, monetary value savings or time savings for improved infrastructure, that kind of thing. But when we're writing to intrinsic values, these include appealing to kind of collective ideas of conservation, social responsibility, justice and fairness, and these are all things that also resonate very strongly with urban climate resilience. So I think it would be more effective to frame our messages around those things when communicating with the public. So values are also context specific. So a lot more research needs to be done, especially in Southeast Asia. And when we're looking at what values resonate with communities, we really need to understand the people that we're talking to in a very deep level and what their values are. And this research was recently completed by Climate Outreach, which was their Global Narratives project, which they ran values workshops to really understand what the values of the communities were, and they came out with a lot of clear frames that can be used, clear pointers that can be used when framing messages around climate resilience that would specifically resonate with those people in India. So keeping the message very local, reflecting national pride in India as a country that is beginning to overcome the challenges, focusing on youth, highlighting impacts of climate change on food and health. These are all messages and frames that would resonate specifically with those audiences. And I think this work from climate outreach really shows that there needs to be a lot more done of this type of work around Southeast Asia and around the world, to understand people's values, to make sure we're communicating our messages in the most effective way possible. So talking about, so when you've understood your values, you need to frame a message. We really need to think about how we're presenting our message. And typically urban climate change resilience, or climate change more broadly, is portrayed as an environmental problem. And there's some that here, environmentalists concerned about climate change. So who works on climate change adaptation? Who works on urban climate resilience? Environmentalists do. It's an environmental issue. Well, if you frame it like that, this allows it to be compartmentalized in people's minds and separates it from people's everyday lives. Urban climate change resilience in particular has an opportunity, I think, to break this boundary down and frame climate change much more as a human issue, grounded in the communications of real issues that are being faced in people's everyday lives. So what we're thinking about when we're looking into those kind of narratives about how to frame your message, well, constructing narratives that people can understand and resonate with their beliefs is really important. So if we look at heatwave, for example, we could frame it on the one hand as an environmental disaster, so that separates it and compartmentalizes it. On the left, I'm talking here at the minute, if you're looking at the slides, that cannot be attributed to climate change entirely. So that breaks down the cause, makes that a bit fuzzier. It's linked to global greenhouse gas emissions, so that takes it from the local issue to a global issue which everyone is contributing to and distances it from the audience. It's caused many deaths because temperatures rose to unprecedented levels, so that's emphasizing the unusual nature of the event, unusually severe again, emphasizing the fact that it was very unusual, an unstoppable tragedy that will inevitably be repeated. So, and that is really taking away the agency of the population to do anything about it, and it is very fatalistic, which is shown to be a real break on people's desire to act. Or we can frame the same heat wave in an entirely different way, and on the right you can say, you know, ideas about risk attribution. It's part of a pattern, again, attributes it to something that's going to continue. Deaths or injuries due to poor infrastructure and lack of green space. So again, that localizes the issue and frames it around aspects that people have more control over in their everyday lives. The poorest are the most effective, which talks to ideas of social justice. Community responses. There was a community response in caring for the vulnerable, so that shows communities that action was taken and people could help in many ways, and it builds a sense of community around this problem. Simple changes can save lives. Air quality made worse, which affected people's health. So health has been shown to be a really a powerful message when it comes to communicating around urban climate change and climate change more broadly. People really respond to issues of health, and they grasp them and understand them. So we can see how we can frame messaging in two different ways. Visual representations of climate impacts can also be powerful. So this infographic is the devastating floods that hit Thailand in some years ago now, 2011, right? Yeah, 2011. but notice that it definitely doesn't frame climate change as an environmental issue. It frames it as part of its impacts on supply chains. And this particular example was actually an infographic that was aimed at policymakers who's so you'll notice there that this is definitely appealing to those extrinsic values of cost and monetary savings and the kind of facts and figures, but because this was directed as a policymaker audience and decision maker audience rather than the public, it kind of recognized that the values of policymakers and those in the private sector also are kind of constrained by other pressures in many ways. That could be the profit motive in the private sector, value for money in government. So when we're talking about attitudes and opinions to climate change, what it often pays to start with the familiar, and this is about taking your message to the people rather than asking them to join you in the academic world of urban climate resilience, right? So this is a story of a guy called Haidkazu Tojo, and I apologize for the pronunciation, obviously, but he is the man who is credited now for getting Americans to eat sushi, right? And in the 1970s, Americans in California did not like the idea of eating raw fish at all, and they did not like the idea of eating seaweed at all. So the idea of raw fish wrapped in seaweed was just a real turn-off. They'd only eat tuna at a push, and sushi restaurants actually began to offer cooked fish to try and get the American audience into their restaurants, which kind of destroys the point of sushi. But Haidkazu realized that what he needed to do is to make sushi more appetizing to the American palate. And so he invented what we now know as the California roll. And he put the rice on the outside, and he used, first of all, he used just vegetables on the inside, and just a bit, sometimes just a bit of tuna. But soon people got used to eating it. They got used to the idea of eating sushi, and they loved it. And last year, the sushi industry in the US had revenues of 2.25 billion US dollars. So well done to Haidkazu, right? So what's the implications of that really for urban climate change resilience? What are the things that people already matter to people around in cities? What are the issues that people are familiar with and are interacting with their everyday lives? I'd argue that we need to start there and work up to the more complex ideas of systemic resilience. We need to start thinking evolution rather than revolution, and understand that, like, kind of sashimi resilience is too big a topic to swallow all at once. So ideas really around traffic and congestion, I mean, these will be familiar to many people living in cities around the world and cities around Asia, right? Traffic and congestion, air quality, housing, sanitation, all feeding into people's health, opportunities and employment, right? These are the problems that people care about in their everyday lives, and these are the things that we need to use as frames to address the issues of climate resilience. So storytelling is a very effective way of communicating our messages on climate change resilience. It allows for the frames and values to be encapsulated in a way that is readily accessible to people and is really easily understandable. People understand and learn new information through stories, and they've been telling stories to do that since humans developed speech, and before even, probably. So scientists and researchers can improve the impact of their work by thinking about how they're going to communicate it through their stories they're telling. And part of that is about humanizing content and finding new messengers. We working with the ACCCRN Network. ACCCRN has their network of champions, which is a great idea and a great initiative to bring resilience to a human level, identifying people working on resilience who have their own stories and telling their stories. And this is Eli Ratni in Blitar, Indonesia, who we created a film about. But storytelling is incredibly powerful for doing that. And this has really started to become taken on by scientists and researchers. Scientists can be uncomfortable moving from kind of academic discourse into policy discussion and public communications. Traditionally, this has not been a job that they've had to undertake. Policy and communications often was a matter for kind of government media. However, climate change debate has been characterized by spectacular kind of misrepresentations of scientific work. And for urban climate change resilience, that could be potentially very problematic. But there are some researchers who are taking kind of really innovative steps to communicate their research findings to local communities. I was going to show you the video around this, but we've had some technical issues, so I'm just going to have to kind of tell you about it. But this was yeah, I'd encourage you all to go and watch it on YouTube. It's called the Lived Experience of Climate Change, and it follows Dr. Joanna Jordan's work on urban climate change resilience in Dakar. So she communicated her research findings to local communities using a potgan approach, which is a traditional theatre performance alongside the University of Dakar. And when you go and watch that video, you'll see how you'll notice how Dr. Jordan touches on several of the themes that we've discussed a bit today. Themes around storytelling, themes around linking the issues of urban climate change resilience and the work and her research work to everyday problems faced in the slums in Dakar. Ideas around performance, the fact that the performance took place in the community and the community was all invited to take part. Hundreds of people turned up to watch the performance, and it's been repeated. The actors from the University of Dakar repeated the performance many times for policymakers and government officials as well, and that's really sparked a lively policy debate which connects the local communities with the politicians and policymakers. So it's been a real success. So I'm going to leave you now with a few tips for communicating with the public that can hopefully improve the impact of your communications work, and these are just some pointers really. The first one is to avoid fatalism. So despair is a real turn off, and people tend to shut down and shut out those ideas around that are too scary to comprehend. If you provide a great problem, point to some solutions. So creating positive agency for people is really important, and if there's a problem standing on its own, is a turn off also for people engagement. Make it clear, and by that I mean really, what are you asking people to do? There's no point in just giving people a lot of information without a kind of sense that they have something, that they are a part of the process of fixing it. Be clear about what you're asking people to take action to do. Be careful when using extremes. So if this is the absolute worst case scenario that you're presenting, you might not want to give that undue prominence, because it can lead to undue amount of fear and kind of and fatigue. Keep it real. What I mean by that is think carefully about the language that you're using especially when you're communicating around scientific terms. Language around likelihood is a really good example of that. Scientists say that things that are very likely, when scientists from the IPCC, for example, say that things are very likely, they're talking about a more than 90% confidence that that will happen. But research again from Europe has suggested that amongst the public opinion on that, very likely means more than sort of a 2/3 chance. So it's a much lower bar in the public's mind than it is in the scientific community. How to communicate uncertainty is kind of, we need to focus on talking about win-win approaches, or no or low regret approaches, so things that have co-benefits for the community, and also draw parallels to other areas of decision making. When do we ever have perfect information about anything? We live with uncertainty all the time. We make decisions around uncertainty all the time. That's why we buy things like insurance. So using ideas that are common to people's understanding and common in everyday in people's minds can help kind of bridge close down the worry around those kind of ideas of uncertainty. Framing around when, not if. So climate predictions are often communicated in what's called a standard uncertain outcome format. So what that means is the statement might say, sea level rise will rise between 25 and 68 centimeters by 2072. But if you flip that statement around and use an uncertain time framing, then the question becomes when and not if. So you can say sea levels will rise by at least 50 centimeters, and this will occur at some point between 2060 and 2093. This is an example, but you can see that by making the time frame uncertain and having a certainty around the outcome, that actually is the when this is going to happen, not if, is a more powerful way of framing that those if impacts. And finally, as we approach the end of this webinar, and I will also be aware of the ticking clock, but beware of the ticking clock. So try and avoid predicting that catastrophe will happen by a specific time, or you have, X amount of days to save your city. This is something that's repeated quite a lot, but it's not a good approach. Invariably, the deadline passes without obvious kind of calamity, and this can also lead to kind of this worry fatigue and people a breakdown in trust, essentially, which can also be a break on action. So thank you ever so much for joining me today. I hope this has been useful. I know it's kind of a very quick overview and there's a lot to cover there. So any one of those topics we could have drilled down into in some detail and depth, but yeah, I hope this has given you some food for thought when you go out and communicate your research findings in the future. Any questions? It'd be great.
Thank you, Will. Thank you very much. So that's such a great presentation, and I'm sure that we all learn a lot. And now I want to read a question from Fitaha. So her question is, how to ensure after the process of dissemination information regarding climate change that the public will engage among themselves to conduct real collective actions? So you might answer the question first.
Yeah, so this is a real question, a real problem, right? Is that I think what we find is that the dissemination of information on its own is simply not enough to drive action, and this goes back to the point around just simply adding information is not sufficient to either convince people A, that you're right, and B, that they should act. And I think actually what we need to do is, first of all, make sure that the information we're provided is framed and presented in a way that people can really understand and really engage with. That's the first thing. But also we need to get much closer to the communities that we're talking about. And we need to have a much greater level of depth of engagement, and I think that as part of the resilience building process in cities, there are already steps which involve very close interaction with communities, workshops around future visioning, and I think these are the perfect opportunities to start building in both research around values and understanding the values and how people will respond, but also to ensure that the public will engage around, understand the actions that they need to take, and I think it's about also presenting information in a way that leads people to take the first step on their journey to resilience. So I think just providing information is only the first kind of stage. We need to say this is something, these are the important issues framed in a way that you understand, and then this is the first step. The other thing we need to identify is new messengers. It's no good having the same people, same scientific communities providing information, and then leaving it at that. We need more champions at the community level who understand the issue and who have influence, and I think that we can identify these, and then we can build up networks around those people, and I think that would go a long way into ensuring that we can move from kind of information to action.
Okay, thank you. So another question from two, how to engage the public into this conservation? So those who are actually not getting direct impacts from climate change or disasters, or we can say who are not much vulnerable.
How to engage public who are not actually getting direct impacts from climate change? Yeah, so I mean that is one of those things that we do see, that climate, that extreme events do provide an opportunity for communications around climate change, an opportunity to change policy. I think, how do we engage the wider public, those who aren't facing direct impacts from climate change? Well, I think there's a number of things. I think one, we have to, local language media needs to be more involved, and that's another messenger issue. To really understand, and I think perhaps more work needs to be done working with journalists. I know the Climate Tracker Initiative, for example, is really leading the way in that work at the moment, training sort of journalists of the future to understand climate change issues. But also we need to think around but also it goes back to this idea of transcendent values as well, of how the public engage with those values, and people do care about the wider impacts of climate change on their environment, on the way they work, on the way their cities operate, and people do care about ideas of justice and fairness, but it's about making sure we're framing those in a way that speaks engage with climate change initially. So I think that again, there's more work to be done to frame our messages for people who aren't natural advocates of climate change. And I think the main problem with that is that a lot of the research and work on communications and engagement has come from people who are naturally engaged with climate change and tend to be hold particular political viewpoints and standpoints, and so we haven't been that good at engaging with people who don't share the same values we do. I think that needs to change.
Okay. So, well, while we're waiting for another question, I'm still allocating time for another one question. If there's any of you that want to ask, please just type in the chat box feature. So, Will, my question is, when we are focusing on publication with human-centered storytelling style that you also mentioned, that we in ACCCRN and Mercy Corps also use that storytelling style, for example, as a champion. But in a more vulnerable individual, how we make sure that we don't victimize them and more focus on how he or she survive the climate change or building his or her resilience. So what do you think about to make sure that we don't victimize this subject?
Yeah, I think it's an important consideration. I think just considering it is the first step to that, right? Is acknowledging that what we don't want to do is just present a whole load of people as kind of victims. And I think in order to do that, we need to present them with the agency to understand and take action to affect their resilience outcomes. I think when we're telling stories, it's important to make sure we can tell the stories of those people, tell the stories, and much in the way that Dr. Joanna Jordan did with her lived experience of climate change, Potgan in Bangladesh. This was something that was done. With a lot of people had their homes flooded repeatedly in some communities, but her approach to communications around that was to involve those people in the results of her study, and suddenly that gave those people a whole new understanding, power, and agency over the issues that were affecting them every day. And it also allowed them to be part of the conversation that moved their story forward. So they watched the play, then the play was also performed for policy makers and decision makers, and they could see that their inputs and their effects had real impacts on those decisions. So it's about connecting the poor and vulnerable, who often are most at risk from climate change impacts, to the positive change that can happen from research work, I'd say.
Okay, thank you, Will. So if there's no other question, we have another. Okay, one last question from Faraz. Most often, climate change issues talk about the risk or consequences if we didn't take action. Do you think that the most effective approach to engage people, or describing the benefit or taking action on tackling climate change, could be more effective to engage people?
Yeah, I think I personally think we need to do both, but I think that what we're doing at the minute is talking just about the risks, right? And we're tending to we tend to talk about climate change and urban around cities and urban climate change as a something that is going to affect us. It's going to have terrible consequences if we don't do X and Y, and people find it very difficult to visualize that. But when we think about the kind of actions that we need to take in order to become more resilient, or that they tend to be things that people that are pretty uncontroversial, can garner a lot of public support anyway. Protecting floods from floods, more green spaces to to improve air quality, making cities more livable. These are things that most people would agree with, whatever their political persuasion, whatever their viewpoints. I think a lot more should be done talking not just about the direct benefits from climate change, but also about the co-benefits that we can get from taking resilience measures, co-benefits to health improvements, co-benefits to improvements in education outcomes even. There is a huge amount more that can be done to connect those things in people's minds, I think.
Okay. Do you still have time to answer another question, Will?
I'm here all day. Yeah, I can answer another question.
Okay,
sure.
Thank you. Great. So we have another question from Clara Grimes. Hi, Will. Thanks for your presentation. Which channels outside of traditional media and municipality organized events have you found to be the most effective ways to reach and involve citizens?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. It's and it's one that kind of everyone struggling with a little bit as well. I mean, first point to say is that traditional media has not been very good so far at communicating climate messages. There doesn't, and it also varies from place to place. So this is all context specific as well. But traditional media has not been there's not been enough of it in communications around climate resilience issues, and when there has been, they often fall into many of the kind of standard traps of communication which we've talked about, which kind of tend to scare people or turn people off or be a brake on action. So they haven't been a great way of doing it. But saying that, they're still the primary channel to reach a very wide audience. They're still very powerful. Radio and television is still very powerful, and newspapers are still very powerful in many parts of the world. So I think there's definitely work to be done there. Municipality organized events, they are very effective at reaching, but again, your audience is limited. When we're talking about online communications, there's an issue around access to the internet. There's which varies dramatically, and what channels are effective. And I think when we're talking about online communications, what I'd say is that it can be very difficult to have impact through, or to promote impact in your message through online communications. But what it does do is it's good for facilitating an onward discussion and conversation once you've got that impact already happened. So I think that we need to have more. I think we need to have more, rather than thinking of it as one municipality organized event. We need to have more local networks of people who communicate around an issue, around climate change issues, and that needs to go beyond just specific events specifically targeting climate change resilience, but it needs to go into climate change resilience needs to be part of discussions around health. It needs to be part of discussions around education. It needs to be part of discussions, and so it needs to break out of kind of events that are specifically organized around climate change, and start being a part of the discussions in all sorts of different conversations that are happening at the local level, for it to really be connected to those issues in people's minds.
Okay, we have another question, Will, from JJ Chua. I hope I pronounced it right. My question is, are there existing strategies as to measuring the impact of communicating resilience to different types of audiences?
They're measuring the impact of communicating resilience to different types of audiences. it's difficult to, it's something that is very difficult to do, and it requires quite a bit of more research. I think actually we're in a place now where we've had quite a limited amount of research even into the initial questions around what the values of people are in different parts of the world. The impact of communications is usually measured in kind of the extent of the population that you reach, and that can be measured online through kind of number of engagements, number of hits with your post, social media posts, for example, and number of articles produced in the kind of circulation. When it comes to understanding kind of the change in attitudes and opinions, well, that actually requires kind of long-term, a bit more of a long-term study to understand what the attitudes and opinions now are, and then measuring the change over time. I'm not aware of those, certainly not in Asia at the minute.
Okay, thank you. So I'm assuming that there are no more questions. Okay, because we already run the webinar for an hour. I hope that we can finish this webinar because the time constraint. Will, do you have any last message or last thing that you want to emphasize to our audience today?
Just thanks everyone for joining. Keep going out and keep talking about climate resilience. Don't stop talking. That's it. Keep the conversations going.
Great. Thank you, Will. Thank you very much for your time and your presentation and for answering all questions. And then, yeah, I hope we can have you in another other opportunity, and maybe another material like communication as well. Thank you, Will.
Please do. Thank you very much. Thanks.